lucky if you have liver problems.
Really?
I
Okay.
don't, I'm too old to change. I don't know.
Okay, so we're in the middle of chapter 35. As Rajas, you have 19 Adar?
19 Adar. That's what it says.
No, I have 18 Adar. Yeah, we're not holding 19 Adar just yet because we didn't do the foot. We didn't know. We didn't do the
18. Yeah, I can.
Okay. Sometimes there's a lot more text in this version that I read through.
Yeah.
Because I don't read the connecting paragraphs, but any of the extra explanatory lines here I read. So sometimes here there was like long paragraphs. It could be okay. So we discussed last week. We discussed last week about, or the last 2 weeks really, the metaphor of the candle, and we discussed that the just like the candle has the flame, the wick, and the oil, so too in order for the flame of God to exist in this world, to burn brightly in this world on the person has a body, which is the wick, and fuel, which allows the wick to survive as long as possible, and for the flame to be lit on the person. What's the fuel? The fuel is mitzvahs. Last week we discussed why the fuel is not the soul, because the soul is not consumable. The soul is meant to be an independent entity that loves God, that is involved. And in order for fuel to be fuel, it must be consumable. It has to be willing to be totally and completely nullified in the oil, in the flame. Okay. So now let's look at it from the other perspective. What is the flame? And when we'll understand what the flame is, or how the flame is able to rest, we'll understand how the flame is able to be here. We'll understand why the fuel needs to be consumable. Is that a good word, consumable? Is there a better word that you would say in the English language? Okay, that's fine.
Very good.
So the term that's used here, if you just look in page 472, in the middle of by 18 Adar, the very first line says the resting of the Shekhinah. Yeah. So the term that we're going to use is Shekhinah. Do you know what the word Shekhinah in Hebrew means? Dwelling. So, for example, a neighborhood in Hebrew is called Shechuna. A neighbor is called a Shachain. Okay, so Shekhinah means dwelling, and therefore, if dwelling by definition is something is dwelling somewhere, or something is dwelling in some place or some time, so it needs to be qualified. So therefore, it says in the Torah, make for me a tabernacle, or make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them. That's where Rashi gets the whole thing coming from the Medrash. What do you mean in them? Make a sanctuary dwell in them, because God dwells in every person. But God, the Shekhinah has to dwell somewhere. Where can the Shekhinah dwell? That sounds like a ludicrous question. What do you mean, where can the Shekhinah dwell? God's everywhere. Where can God not dwell? So what does it mean? Where can God dwell? So we'll use a physical metaphor, or a metaphor that's material that we can identify. If you want, if you're you have an abundance, an overflowing, you're extracting honey, and the honey's flowing out, and the jar is filling up, and you say, I need somewhere to put this honey. Bring me a jar. And your assistant is there, and your assistant runs and brings you a jar, and they bring you a full jar of honey. What are you going to do?
Yeah,
You probably fire them, because
I give them the benefit of the doubt and so bring that empty one.
Okay, that's if they weren't helping you fill up the jar.
Yeah.
But if they're helping you fill up the jar, and you say, okay, go bring another one, and they bring you a full jar,
Yeah.
that person probably can't figure out how to help you properly. Oh, I mean, obviously you can have mercy and keep them and have the benefit of the doubt. I'm just speaking in theory.
One time.
One time, exactly, exactly.
Yeah, one mistake.
Why? Why is that? Because in order for something to receive something and contain something, it must have room. It must be empty. Well, it doesn't have to be totally empty. It depends how much you're trying to put in. So if you're only looking to deposit an ounce of honey and there is a gallon jug of honey that has a few ounces left to fill, you're not going to fire him. On the contrary, you're going to be happy he brought you a jug of honey to fill and not waste a whole new jug on just 1 ounce of oil, one ounce of honey, right? But there needs to be empty space in order, if you want to listen to someone wants to vent. Can you be talking at the same time or thinking about something else at the same time? No. Because in order to receive, to listen to what they're saying, you must be empty. If you're not empty, then you're not receiving, and portraying yourself as a receptacle is deceiving. Yeah. So if we want to be a dwelling place for God, if we want God to dwell in us, what do we have to be? What do we have to create? With openness, an empty space, a space where we don't exist, where we do. Now, remember, with God, from God's perspective, nothing really exists, nothing else really exists. So it's not that we have to open up space. I'm willing to accept God. If there is an I that's willing, that has a thought process here, in other words, if something else exists besides God, I'm not creating a receptacle for God. Can God decide to be here? God's everywhere. God, the question is, how am I experiencing God? Is God dwelling with me, or is God just here by knowledge? Do I feel God's presence? I can if I create an open space for him. And one of the metaphors that's brought in Chassidus about this is that when a king, I don't know if you know, I mean, it's quite obvious, but most people don't think about it. A crown, a royal crown, is very heavy because it's made out of gold and stones. It's a very heavy object. Yeah, the king doesn't always wear the crown. Most of the time, the king isn't wearing the crown. Where does the king place the crown when he's not wearing the crown? So today we wouldn't know. I mean, today they wear the crown once in a lifetime or whatever. They put it in some safe. But back in the day when the king wore the crown, when he walked around the palace, but not when he was sitting in his chambers, where did the king place the crown? So there'd be some sort of pole or stick that you'd place the crown on top of it, hook like, or shelf to place the crown on top of it. And the sages asked the question, why didn't the king place the crown on top of a servant? Wouldn't it be more respectable for the crown to be placed on someone's head as opposed to just on the shelf?
Inappropriate.
Why?
Because he's not royal. He's not the king.
So what, the shelf isn't needed a king?
No, but the shelf is a storage place.
So take the servant and make him a storage place. The shelf is the servant seems to be closer to the king. If you want to do a hierarchy, the servant is closer to the king than the shelf. You're absolutely right. I'm playing devil's advocate to prove the point that because the shelf is further from the king, there is no possibility of the shelf thinking when it's wearing the crown, it might be the king. Or it might be closer to the king. Because it's totally devoid of anything that can oppose the king. But if the servant is wearing the king, wearing the crown, no matter how good of a servant he is, no matter how submissive of a servant he is, he may think I'm better than the other servant, which means I'm something here too. And that's why when King Ahasuerus in the Purim story, when Haman told him, when Ahasuerus asked him, what should I do to the man who the king wishes to honor? And Haman gave this idea of dressing the man in the king's robes, and this man should ride on the king's horse and wear the king's crown. Ahasuerus was horrified. How Haman is dreaming of being the king. This is horrible news. Yeah. Okay. And by the way, there are a number of places where you see this clearly in the Torah. Moses, all over Jewish literature, Moses, and even in the Torah, a number of times it makes reference to this. Moses was considered a mouthpiece for God. What Moses spoke came from God. You know what Moses needed to have that almost no one else has in order to be that mouthpiece for God? Or you know what Moses had to lack in order for him to be the mouthpiece for God? Speech impediment. He couldn't talk. The only way anyone would believe that what's coming from his mouth is from God, the only way God can express himself through Moshe's mouth is if Moshe didn't have a mouth of his own. Because once Moshe has a mouth of his own, now you don't know if what he's saying is what God wants or not. But Moshe on his own, before God gave the Torah through Moses, Moses couldn't speak. Whether it means he had a stutter or you couldn't hear him, whatever it was, Moshe couldn't communicate properly to people. He needed Aaron, his older brother, to understand him, to interpret what he was saying. Yeah? Same thing it says prophets. When a prophet rose to the level of receiving prophecy, when he would receive prophecy, he would fall to the ground if he was standing. Usually he would be in the middle of a sleep, but he would fall to the ground. His physical functions stopped working. Literally, his physical functions stopped working in order to receive prophecy, except for Moses. Certain prophets were different levels of prophecy. But generally speaking, besides for Moses, prophets would lose their physical capacities during prophecy, because you can't have God. Not you can't. God, the way God made it was that he can't rest in a revealed way. God's everywhere, but he can't be exposed to the human being while the human being is a human being. And that's why the Torah says when Moses asked God to see God, God said, a human being can't see me and live. Because if you're a human being, if you're an independent entity, you can't see me. You could see my back, you could see some parts of me, you could see shadows, you could see illusions. But even those, the prophets have to lose their physical capacities. And even the Jewish people that received the Torah, what did they have to say in order to receive the Torah? Naaseh v'nishma, will do, and then will. In other words, they had to sort of distance themselves from their own human nature. Human nature is, I don't do what I'm told, I do what I understand, or what makes sense to me. And for the Jewish people to receive the Torah, they had to say, no, I'm going to empty myself of my own desires and my own wants. I'm going to accept what God wants. I'm not going to become an angel. I'm still going to be a human. Therefore, I'm going to try to understand everything. But I'm not going to let that be a precondition. I'm going to empty myself of preconditions. Okay, so let's look a little bit inside. Middle of 472. The resting of the Shekhinah means, in other words, when we single out a specific object from a world filled with the Shekhinah. So the Shekhinah is everywhere. So what does it mean we want the Shekhinah to rest on the person? So when we single out a specific object, we say that the divine presence rests upon that object, its uniqueness lies in the revelation of godliness. In other words, God's everywhere. But where do we see godliness? And the Ein Sof light in that particular object. That's what we mean when we say we want the Shekhinah to rest on you. The Shekhinah is with you anyway. But resting means it's revealed. Yeah, when someone comes into their house and rests, they take off their shoes, they take off their outer clothing, they may even take off all their clothing. They reveal themselves, they're comfortable, they reveal themselves. That's what it means to rest. This means to say that this object that the Shekhinah is resting in is comprised within God's light and is nullified out of existence toward him. In other words, he has no separate identity. For only then can the one God rest upon it, upon the object, and reveal himself in it. But anything not completely nullified out of existence toward the godly light cannot have God's light rest and reveal itself within it. By the way, nullified doesn't mean you become a doormat to everything and to everyone. Nullified means towards God. In other words, I realize that compared to God, I'm nothing. Compared to the other person, God created me for a reason. Of course, I'm something. I can contribute towards the world. But when we compare ourselves towards God, then we're nothing. Even a perfect tzaddik who cleaves to him with abundant love, which is a most lofty level of love and attachment to God, which we will learn about later in the coming chapters, even in the case of such a tzaddik, no thought can truly grasp him at all, because he's a tzaddik, he's something, he's not totally nullified. For the true implication of the phrase God is the Lord, is the true Lord, is his unity and oneness, that he alone exists. Remember, when we say God's oneness in Hasidus, or generally according to Hasidus, we don't mean that God is the only God. We mean that God is the only thing. The only true existence. He alone exists, and there is absolutely nothing besides him. So my existence is but an expression of his existence. If so, this person, in other words, even the above mentioned tzaddik who loves God and who is a separate, but still is a separate being in his own self-perception, as is evident from the very fact that he loves God. If he loves God, that means it's a he, rather than a non-entity. So no thought of his can grasp him at all. As long as he's an entity, he can't grasp God in its entirety. So here, what we're saying is no matter how much Torah you're going to learn, you're not going to grasp God. We'll soon see this clear. Even the tzaddik cannot grasp God and thereby become one with him through the faculties of his own soul. Therefore, God's light does not abide or manifest itself in him except through the fulfillment of the mitzvot, which constitute his actual will and wisdom without any concealment of countenance. Since the inner aspect of the divine will stands revealed only in the mitzvot, it is only by means of them that the light of the Shekhinah rests upon man, not through spiritual devotion alone. So studying Torah, for example, which we'll learn about soon, is God's will. But it's not in a revealed way. It manifests itself in someone helping out their friend, in not stealing, etc. That's God's will manifest. So it's not God's real will in a revealed way. It's hidden. Whereas when God says eat kosher, that's God's will in a revealed way. That's actually God's will. So the way to be a abode for God to reveal himself is by doing a mitzvah, because then you're totally nullifying your own will and revealing God's will in a revealed way. Whereas when you love God, true, you love God, but there's a you. There's something here. Just to bring out this point that the less you are, the more you're able to be a receptacle to God. There was once a chassid, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe asked him to become a shochet. You know what a shochet is? Well, a ritual slaughter. So in those days, the shochet many times was the butcher as well, but not always. Many times it wasn't like that. And this chassid didn't want to because he didn't trust himself. He said, "How can I?" He doubted whether he would be able to do it properly, and that a mistake shouldn't, if he makes one mistake and a whole town can eat non-kosher food, that's a huge responsibility. So the Rebbe Rashab responded to him and said, "What do you want? We should have a shochet, someone who doesn't think he'll make a mistake. That's the person you want to be the shochet. You want someone who doubts himself, who might make a mistake, and therefore will be extra vigilant and extra careful." Okay. Now we're going to address a mystical thing. It's a what does he call it here? It's like a footnote, but it's in the Tanya itself, but it's a note where the Alter Rebbe explains this in mystical terms. Many times, because Tanya really, although it addresses mystical concepts, it's not really a book of Kabbalah. It's not. So here, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain how this stems, how we see this in the spiritual worlds in Kabbalah. Just a brief introduction. We're not going to get too deep into it, but just so we understand what the Alter Rebbe is going to say. We know that there are many, many levels that we talk about, the different worlds and different attributes and different things. And one of the most famous concepts in Kabbalah is the 10 Sefirot, right? God's 10 attributes. Now, you would think 10 attributes really are independent of each other. A person can be kind without knowledgeable or without being smart. A person can be kind without being tough. A person can be tough without being kind, or a person can be tough without being thoughtful about it. So the fact that the pyramid, so to speak, of the 10 Sefirot is top down is just illustrational purposes. It's not, Kabbalah tells us that's not the case. When we talk about the 10 Sefirot, number one is number one because everything comes through number one. So number 9 has actually gone through the previous 8, and it expresses itself as a new concept as number 9, etc. But the question is why? Why is this necessary and what's the point? So what's explained is like this, that the first time the 10 Sefirot, the 10 divine attributes are created or exist, they act as a sort of doorstep, so to speak, between God, between the infinite God and the finite world. But how do we get, and this is really very superficial, what I'm saying here really isn't true because in many places I explain this itself as a creation, but just as an overall purpose, this is how we're going to illustrate it. How do you get from an infinite to defined attributes? It's a contradiction in terms. If it's infinite, you can't have defined 10 attributes. How do you make that transition? So in order to make that transition, we have the first attribute, the first sephira, which is Chokhmah. How is Chokhmah usually translated? Wisdom or knowledge? I think more often it's, although I think knowledge and then Bina would be wisdom. Well, let me ask you, what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? And knowledge is just information. Okay, so Chachma would be knowledge, information. Correct. So what is Chachma? Chachma is you've got a problem. The problem is that your wife scheduled a 10 o'clock doctor's appointment and you scheduled a 10:30 golf game with your buddies, but you realize you only have one car because the other car is at the mechanic, and you don't want your wife to take a taxi and you don't want to take a taxi. So what do? You're in a pickle. There's no way out. Many people get frustrated and upset, live in this world that there's no way out, and either they're calm and they'll cancel their game, but it's overwhelming, but they're stuck in their box. And then you have Chachma. Chachma is where a person allows himself to think out of the box. He allows other information to come in. Where does this other information come from? We don't know. What we do know is that when you step back and say, you know what, maybe I don't have all the answers, or maybe this isn't the only solution, and you just allow yourself to relax and take off the barrier, a thought may pop into your mind, and you say, wait, that could work, but how? And then you use your wisdom to figure out, can it work? I remember there's a neighbor next door that offered a long time ago to take us if we need to go somewhere. So, yeah, but you don't know if they're in town. Okay, so you have to find out if they're in town. So what's Chokhmah? Chokhmah is the allowance of outside information to enter. The word in Hebrew, Chokhmah, is made up of two other Hebrew words. Hoach, ma. Hoach means power. Ma means what. And what Chokhmah really is, we don't know. We don't know what it is. Where did this information come from? What do you have? Like a guardian angel that's putting information in your head? Do you have secret eyes in the back of your head that just saw new information? So a lot of times, and this could be very deep, scientific discoveries happen a lot of times. Just someone had an idea. Let's try this. Where did that idea come from? We don't know. It came from their mind. If it came from their mind, who put it into their mind? So in Chachma is the personification of bittul, of nullification, of non-existence. In other words, you exist, your head's there, your mind is working, but what you're doing is you're putting yourself totally aside. You're opening yourself up 100% to allowing something else inside. You don't even know where it comes from. And that's the transition, so to speak, from the infinite. Once you allow the infinite in, once you allow the infinite in, now you can sort of form it and shape it. Once this thought came into your head, now you could think about it. You could take it apart, and then you could apply it. You could feel good about it. You could feel generous about it. You could feel disciplined about it. And it goes through all the 10 attributes. You know what it says in Ethics of Our Fathers? Who is wise? You know, it says, who is wealthy? You know what it says? Who's wealthy? Someone who's who's content in their lot, happy in their lot. Who's wise? So the same Mishnah in Ethics of Our Father says, who's wise? Someone who learns from every person. Now, conventionally, if you walked into any school in the world and you asked them who's wise, what would they tell you? What would any kid or any adult, the teacher? So the Mishnah should have said, who's wise? Someone who teaches more people, or someone who understands more things. But that's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says, Ezehu chacham. Chacham comes from the word chachma. Who is truly wise? Who's able to understand infinite things?
The one who doesn't know what he knows.
The one who's willing to learn from every single person. There's no person in the world that I say, no, I know more than them. There's nothing I could learn from them, because now you're closing yourself up to the infinite. This is what the Alter Rebbe is going to discuss in this note here. And again, he's just illustrating mystically why it is this way, that in order to receive God, the Shekhinah, you have to self-nullify, so to speak. This accords with what I heard from my teacher, the Maggid of Mezrich, peace upon him, on the meaning of the reason behind the statement of the Eitz Chaim, that the Ein Sof light does not unite itself, even with the world of Atzilut, the first highest world, the world of emanation, except by first vesting itself in the attribute of Chachma, wisdom. See, here the translation is wisdom, but I think knowledge is probably a better translation. I don't know. This is because the Ein Sof is the true one, which means that he alone exists, and there is naught besides him. And this, in fact, is the level of Chachma. Because the level of Chachma is where I don't exist. I consider myself ignorant compared to the person standing in front of me. I'm not saying I don't know more information than he does, but compared to him right now, I'm ignorant. If I'm ignorant, I can learn from him. If I'm not ignorant, then I'm limiting what I could learn from him. And if I'm smarter than him, I can't learn anything from him. Okay? By the way, so in order to connect to God, you have to basically totally devoid yourself of any self-desires, self-wants, etc. We find this actually in the Torah in a number of places. Abraham. The first mention of Abraham in the Torah of anything special or significant is when God spoke to him at the age of 75. What happened to all his he devoted his life to God for the first 72 years of his life, going to the Medrash. From the age of 3, he was spreading the word of God. But he was all doing it because that's the conclusion he came to. He was doing what made sense to him. The Medrash speaks about it. It's important to know why God chose him. But that wasn't yet divine work. That was his own work. The first time Abraham becomes Abraham, he becomes a servant of God, he becomes subservient to God, is when God tells him leave and he goes. Doesn't question, he doesn't ask, he doesn't debate, he doesn't doubt. He goes because there he removed himself from the picture and followed God. Same thing in the desert. Korach comes to Moses. You don't remember what Korach's complaint was to Moses? We're all holy. So what does the Medrash say? What does Rashi bring down? What was the example he used? You know what the example he used was? He asked Moses, if I have, so we wear tzitzit. Biblically, what makes the tzitzit I'm wearing now, biblically, in biblical times, when the color, the blue shaded color, whatever color it was, existed, I would not be wearing kosher tzitzit. Because in order for tzitzit to be, the way they're described in the Torah is that the string, one of the 4 strings, one of the 8 strings that ties around the others is techelet, is a certain type of blue. I don't have that. But Korach went to Moses and said, let's say I have a garment that's blue, this shade of blue. Does it need tzitzit? And Moses said yes. And Korach didn't understand that. In other words, Korach was asking, if I'm a Jew in my heart, if I'm a passionate Jew, do I still need to do the mitzvahs? He asked Moses, if my house is full of Torah scrolls, does it need a mezuzah on the door? Okay, the average person's house, they've got nothing holy inside. Today we have books. Back then, there was no books. What did people have in their homes? No one had holy objects in their homes. Tefillin, you took to the shul, or maybe they stayed in the shul. What did you have in your house that was holy? Nothing. So you need a mezuzah on the door. So he asked Moses, a mezuzah that's full of Torah scrolls, do you need a mezuzah? Moses said, yes. You still need the mitzvah. Because it's not about how I want to connect to God. It's not about if you want to connect to God a certain way, God's not there. That's you can be sure of because it's how you want. And if there's a you, God's not there. A mitzvah is the one opportunity where we could get rid of ourselves, so to speak, and do what God wants. Like the example of the flowers that I like to use. If your wife asks you for flowers and you bring a love note, that love note is not a love note to your wife, it's a love note to yourself. Your wife is not smiling at that love note. But if you bring her flowers, even if you bring her 10 love notes, of course, the other love notes are beautiful and helpful. But what most touches her is the flowers, because you gave in to her will. You put your will aside and gave in to her will. Okay, so now the question is, why can't we accomplish this through Torah study? Why can't we do this through Torah? Why do we need mitzvahs, physical mitzvahs? Many people actually experience this. They love studying Torah. It talks to them. Maybe not all the details, but usually, what are the details that don't talk to someone who enjoys studying Torah? The practical. In other words, the mitzvahs. But the Torah itself talks to them. They may even love God. Why isn't that enough to make God's presence rest on me? There was once a story with the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. He was approached by a chassid with a dilemma, a real dilemma. Now, for someone who's doesn't know much about religion, this dilemma would seem absurd. But if you're a religious person, the dilemma makes sense. He had a child, and he needed to give a bris. And there were 2 mohels in the city, 2 mohelim in the city. One of them was very old, very pious, very experienced, but old. And his hands were starting to get a little shaky. The other one was young, professional, but his level of piety wasn't up there. But he knew how to do the job well, but his piety level wasn't up there. And for a religious Jew, you look, especially a bris, to induct a child into Jewish people, you want someone who's a spiritual person. So they came to the Tzemach Tzedek and asked him, which mohel should they choose? It's probably obvious to you what the Tzemach Tzedek said, but I don't know. Want to guess what the Tzemach Tzedek answered? No. Tzemach Tzedek said, for a bris, you take the young one that's hands aren't shaking. In other words, if you want to ask me, who should I get as a teacher to teach others to be a mohel, take the old person. Take the one whose hands are shaky. But the life of a child is in your hands. You don't mess around with that. So we understand why it's not enough to be a Jew in your heart, why it's not enough to figure out your own way to connect to God. You need to tap in and figure out, how does God want you to connect to him? Well, why can't we do that through Torah study? Torah is also God's will, it's God's wisdom. Why can't we connect through there? Why is it important, like the opening verse of the Tanya, in the introduction of the Tanya, to do it? That's the final word. This is close to you in your mind and your heart to do, in your mouth and in your heart to do it. Why is doing it so important? So, just to revisit a point we made before, there's once a Hasidic master asked the students, where is God? Where is God found? And his students were perplexed by this question. What do you mean, where's God found? It says God's everywhere. So no one said anything. So he answered his own question. God is found where you let him in. Obviously, God's found everywhere, as we know. But what we mean by where is God found is, where is he seen? Where is he revealed? And based on what we discussed previously, God's revealed where we allow him to be revealed. How do you allow God to be revealed? By removing yourself, making space for God to be revealed. And by the way, this is, someone who's a egotistical person. You can tell wherever they go, everything's about them. They don't leave room for other people. It's not the complicated. It's not like for God, it's much more so. But it's not a complicated thing. It's human nature. If I'm about myself, I don't leave room for God. This is what it means when it says that, it says in the Talmud, if man and woman merit, God rests between them in their marriage. If not, then God isn't there. How do we know this? Or where do you see this? So you see this in the words man and woman. How do you say man in Hebrew? Ish. Because many people say Adam, but Adam really is human. Although it does, usually it is a male name. It doesn't refer to a man, but really Adam is human. Ish is man. And how do you say woman? Isha. So they both have the same syllables, right? Aleph and Shin. The difference is that the Ish has a Yud between the Aleph and Shin. It's a vowel, but it's there between the Aleph and the Shin. And the woman has a Hey vowel at the end of the word. Isha is a Hey at the end. If you take the vowels out, what do the words spell? Aleph Shin is Aish. What does Aish mean? Fire. So it says, if God is present in the marriage, if there is a man and a woman, if there is the Yud and the Hey, which is one of God's names, or the two first letters of God's, the 4-letter name, but it's also an independent name of God, Yud Hey. If God is present in the marriage, then you have a man. If you have a man and a woman, and then you can have a child. If God isn't present in the marriage, what do you have? Fire. Fire looks very enticing. It's very looks beautiful and enticing, but you get too close to it and it can totally consume you. What does it mean if man and woman merit? Merit what? Did they win the lottery? No, they merit, they place God between them. In other words, they bring God into their marriage. If they bring God into their marriage, how? How do you bring God into your marriage? By making space for God. In other words, by conducting your marriage in the way God wants. There's rules in the Torah how to live, how a husband and wife can live together in a Torah way. If we make space, God rests there. In other words, we take away what we want. I want to do this. Yeah, but the Torah says you can't do it. I'm not going to do it. So now there's room for God to rest there. And now it's a husband and wife that can create a family. So now the question is, we're all made up of a body and a soul. And if you learn Tanya, you know you don't only have a body and a soul, you have two souls. So where exactly do we want God to rest? Where are we trying to bring God in? When we say bring God into us, where are we trying to bring him into? You would think to the divine soul, right? That's the part that's connected to him. But that's not the answer. You know why? Right, but how do we know that? How do you know? You're right, because it has to go into the body and the animal soul too. How do you know that? It's logical. It's not a because the soul existed before the world was created as a part of God. If the point is to bring godliness into the soul, then don't create this world. But God created the world. He made a body and a soul that are antithetical to God. So if he just wants the Shekhinah to rest in the divine soul, why put the divine soul in a body that stops God from getting there? Just to put an obstacle in its way? No, we want to bring God into the body. You know, they tell a story. Mayer likes to tell the story of the communist teacher, the atheist teacher who was teaching, the Jewish kids were forced to go to school then, to public, to the government school. And he was trying to eradicate God and religion from the kids' minds. So he was telling them that if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. Can anyone see God? Can anyone see a soul? No. What does Saul always say? Never came up on an MRI. No soul. So one of the kids jumps up and says, has anyone seen the teacher's mind? Doesn't exist. Huh? In other words, when we study Torah, that's connected to our soul. By the way, this will be confusing for our conversation, but just to keep in your mind, there are two aspects of studying Torah. There's studying Torah. Studying Torah is also one of the 613 mitzvahs. So when we're comparing studying Torah to mitzvahs, we're going to contrast and say that the purpose is mitzvahs and not Torah study. We are not talking about the mitzvah of Torah study. What's the difference? What's the difference between the mitzvah of Torah study and Torah study that's not a mitzvah? Ever thought about that? We always talk about, you come to classes, but do a mitzvah. Studying Torah is a mitzvah too. So why is it not enough to study Torah? Why is studying Torah not a mitzvah? Or why does it not rise to the level of a mitzvah?
Intent.
Very good. In other words, and by the way, intent is also connected with which part of Torah am I studying, or why am I studying, but it also could bleed into which part of Torah I'm studying. In other words, the mitzvah to study Torah is to know what to do, to live a godly life, and to learn God's wisdom. So if you learn Torah without an ulterior motive, and the ulterior motive is and should be to understand and to try to innovate the Torah. Once you want to innovate in Torah, which is, by the way, our purpose here, that's not the mitzvah of Torah study. That's connecting to God's wisdom, but it's not the mitzvah of Torah study, because now you're involving yourself. And that's the point. If I read the words of the Torah and not try to understand it according to how I understand it, or not try to innovate, not try to figure out what to do in a case where the Torah doesn't speak about it, if I'm not going to involve my own mind, then I'll never be able to reach a conclusion. So I must involve my own mind. But then I'm sort of drifting away from the mitzvah of Torah study to the concept of Torah study. And that's what we're going to contrast today. We're going to contrast coming and studying Tanya, which is, why am I studying Tanya? I'm studying Tanya for two reasons. Either because I want to study God's wisdom, I want to connect to spiritual ideas, or because I want it to affect me. I want to learn from it. I want to absorb it. Both of these things are self. I'm involved, yeah? But if you're coming to study Tanya because You learned in the Torah that you're supposed to study Torah, so you come to class to study Torah, but it really doesn't interest you. It doesn't. It can involve. Then you'd just be doing the mitzvah. You wouldn't be studying Torah. And by the way, if you didn't understand what you were saying, you wouldn't be able to say the blessing on the Torah because you're not understanding. But when you read the verses in the Torah, when we call people to an aliyah, they make the blessing even though they don't understand what they're saying. Why? Because it's God's words. But that's not studying Torah. Someone gets on aliyah and reads a whole bunch of Hebrew words, they don't understand what they're saying. That's the mitzvah of studying Torah because that's what God said. But it doesn't. It's not this Torah. So the Torah study we're talking about here is not the mitzvah because Torah study does have that element that it's a mitzvah as well. Again, it could be confusing throughout, but just to keep that in mind, there's two elements of Torah study. So when we're going to compare Torah study to mitzvahs, we're not talking about the mitzvah element in the Torah study. Okay. So now, when I study Torah, this is a spiritual endeavor. So where is God resting when I study Torah? In my soul. It's a beautiful thing, but it's not the purpose. The purpose is for God to rest in the body, in the animal soul. Torah study alone doesn't accomplish that. Let's see this inside. When a person studies Torah, this is 19 of that. When a person studies Torah using his powers of thought and speech, his neshama, his divine soul with its two inner garments only, vis-a-vis the faculties of speech and thought, are absorbed within the light of God, the Ein Sof, blessed be He, and are merged within it in perfect unity. So the soul is one with God. This constitutes the resting of the Shekhinah on his divine soul. As our sages have said, when even one person applies himself diligently to Torah study, the Shekhinah is with him. Meaning, in this case, that the Shekhinah rests upon his divine soul and upon its faculties of thought and speech, which are engaged in the mental and oral study of the Torah. However, one second. Okay, before we continue, before the however, they tell the story of a student that was studying to be a shochet, to be a ritual slaughterer, and he studied all the books, but he never actually went and got a hands-on trial. So the rabbi wants to test him, so he gives him a hands-on trial. So he brings him a lung of an animal, and he asks him, "Is it kosher?" So this student says, "I studied all the laws, but I never actually saw this. What is it?" So he says, "It's a cork of it's a lung." So this is the holy lung, and so he looks at it and he's able to determine if it's kosher or not. But the term he uses the holy lung. In other words, he was studying Torah. When he was studying Torah, he was studying the wisdom of God. So the lung became a holy lung because he was studying it within the context of Torah. Yeah. In other words, his viewpoint of the world was it was a soul attitude, it was a soul perspective that he had towards the world because it was all through the lens of Torah. So the only thing that was affected was the spirituality of it, or the purity of it connected to his soul. Based on what we discussed, that in order for God to reside somewhere, we have to let him in. If we want God to reside within the body, we need to do something with the body. It's not enough to study Torah. We have to give tzedakah. We have to eat kosher. We have to put on tefillin. We have to light Shabbos candle. We have to help another person. We have to use our physical limbs. Now, again, when you're studying Torah, you're also using your physical limbs, right? Your concentration, your ears to hear, your mouth to speak. So if you're doing the mitzvah of Torah study, yes, it absolutely does the same thing as everything else. But if it's only the soul of Torah study, in other words, you're doing the spirituality element of it, so then your eyes and ears are not being absorbed. They're not really vacant. What's vacant here is the soul, the spirituality of it. But really, your arms are not actively part in eliminating themselves, so to speak. But when you're doing the mitzvah, then you're making a vacancy. Your arm could have been drawing or playing a card game, and now your arm is helping an old lady cross the road, like the famous example, or doing any other mitzvah. So the fact that the Shekhinah rests on the soul, it's not a new thing. The Shekhinah always within the soul. You want a novelty, you need a mitzvah. And the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us not only when doing a mitzvah does the Shekhinah rest in the body, you know where else the Shekhinah rests? In the animal soul. Now, usually, up until now in Tanya, we've thought of the animal soul as sort of the fighting part, the thing that fights everything the godly soul wants. But really, the animal soul is not necessarily a fighter. Sometimes the animal soul can be a middleman between the soul and the body. The soul and the body are polar opposites. And one, the soul, it's almost like you imagine if a bird comes down into a body of water and the fish comes up to the top of the thing and they fall in love. They meet, they talk, they fall in love. And then they want to go to their comfort zone, to their warm spot, to be with the other person, with the other one. What's going to happen? The bird's going to fly to the heavens, and the fish is going to go all the way down to the bottom of the pond. The soul, by nature, soars up. The body, by nature, wants to go deep down. Now, yes, you can control it, you can hold it, but naturally, they're drifting apart. So how do we combine them? We combine them by the use of the animal soul. The animal soul is sort of, it's the animal soul rests in and is compared to blood in the body. Blood is also sort of a physical thing, just like bones and the flesh in your body. So how does the blood give life? How does the body become alive? Because the blood possesses something the rest of the body doesn't. The blood possesses a spiritual element to it. What's the spiritual element the blood possesses? The blood has something spiritual that's much harder to measure or define than every other part of your body. You know what it is? Heat, warmth. Compared to blood, warmth is more spiritual, right? It's not tangible. You can't touch warmth. You can feel it, but it's emanating from a physical object, and yet it's not physical. Because what happens when you take blood out of the person and you let it sit for a few minutes? What happens to it? It doesn't have warmth. What happened? Where did the warmth come from? So there's the spiritual element. So in chapter 1 in Tanya, we said that the animal soul rests in the blood, which gives life to the body. It's the life force of the body. So the animal soul is sort of this middleman between the godly soul and the body. So when the animal soul, so usually we talk about the animal soul being in prison in the body. What happens when one day you decide, you know what? My animal soul is telling me to sleep in and not to come to Tanya class. I'm going to wake up and come anyway. So now who's in charge? Your godly soul. But how did your godly soul convince your body to come? Because your godly soul now put your animal soul in prison. What does it mean in prison? Now your animal soul is subservient to your godly soul. Your animal soul now will do what your godly soul, because it's in handcuffs. So now when your godly soul tells your animal soul, go to shul, the animal soul gives life to the body and the body goes to shul. It doesn't have a choice. That's what a Beinoni is, right? A Beinoni is not someone who gets rid of his animal soul. A Beinoni is someone who subdues his animal soul. It doesn't kill him, needs him, but uses the animal soul to fulfill his will. So the animal soul exists, but it exists as subservient to the Beinoni. So now we understand why we need action. Because when you do a mitzvah, in other words, when the godly soul is in charge and you do the mitzvah, now the Shekhinah rests on the animal soul and on the body. Because by definition, what happened? The godly soul put the animal soul in prison. Now the animal soul is sort of nullified. It doesn't have a will and desire of its own. I mean, it still wants, but it can't express that. It made space. Now God's presence rests on the animal soul and on the body that actually does the mitzvah, or on the part of the body that does the mitzvah. Yeah, let's look at this inside. However, this 476. However, in order to draw the light and radiance of the Shekhinah upon his body and animal soul as well, which is the purpose, in other words, upon the vitalizing soul actually clothed in the body, not the godly soul, and providing for it a corporeal life force, one must fulfill the practical mitzvot. In other words, commandments involving the faculty of action, which are performed with the body itself. In this way, the actual body, the actual power of the body engaged in this act, for example, when one dons tefillin, it is the physical strength in his arm that impels the motions that constitute the fulfillment of the mitzvah. And therefore, his bodily power is absorbed in the divine light and will and merges with it in perfect unity. So this power of the body constitutes the third garment of the divine soul. As mentioned in chapter 4, the divine soul expresses itself in the faculty of action through performing mitzvot. So there's three garments. There's thought, speech, and action. Through studying Torah, that's the godly soul expressing itself in thought and speech. And through mitzvahs, it's through action. Now, again, there are some mitzvahs that are expressed through thought. For example, love of God, expressed through thought. Prayer is expressed through speech. And even Torah can sometimes be expressed through action, like carrying the Torah, by writing it. There are other mitzvahs. So it does overlap, but primarily, study of Torah is the godly soul expressing itself in thought and speech, and mitzvahs is action. So when the faculty of action is absorbed within the divine will, then, in addition, the power of the vitalizing soul actually clothed within the body, the power of the soul derived from Klipat Noga, is transformed from evil to good and is actually absorbed in holiness, exactly like the divine soul, for it is the power of the animal soul that implements and performs the act that constitutes the mitzvah. For without this power of the animal soul, the divine soul would not affect the body at all, since it is spiritual and the body physical and corporeal. So that body and divine soul are antithetical, as are the spiritual and material dimensions generally. The intermediary between them is the vitalizing animal soul clothed in man's blood, which is in his heart and throughout his body. Sorry about that. Okay. I think we'll pause here. Just to conclude with, you know what? Let's pause here, and so we're going to take a bigger break than usual, and we will finish this chapter and maybe even start the next chapter on, God willing, on August the 27th, the 28th. Sorry. You know what? I'm actually going to open my calendar because I know my wife told me that week is full of appointments because that's the week Levi's back in camp, the week before school, and all the kids have doctor's appointments. Okay. The kids have a dentist appointment at 11 o'clock. I don't know. We may even have to, but for now, let's schedule them, but don't show up if you don't hear from me that there's class. because it'll be crazy and I might forget to send out a message. So maybe reach out the day before or something. If you don't see it in the email, then you know it's not happening. But if you do, or if you don't see, if you can't find the email, just send me a message before you come.